Hello, and thanks for joining us today for ACI Learning's Audit webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Now let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to the ACI Learning's webinar series. I'm so glad that you've joined us. Today, our presenter, Dr. Lauren Primuth, will talk about effective audit report writing alongside Dr. Hernan Murdock, ACI Learning's audit instructor. Dr. Lauren Primuth currently serves as the Director of Learning Design at ACI Learning. Prior to her work developing processes and vision for learning in the audit, cybersecurity, and IT training course space, Lauren had worked with top universities to design programs for scale and efficiency. She also helped faculty become proficient in teaching effectively online, supporting their goals for integrated classroom spaces. Prior to that role, she worked at a top university, teaching students how to write effectively for over a decade. She has her master's degree in applied linguistics and her PhD in curriculum and instruction. Dr. Hernan Murdock speaks at conferences in the U.S. and abroad, and is author of numerous articles and books on varieties of topics, including internal audit, fraud, and more. He holds professional designations as a CIA and CRMA. He currently serves as the Vice President of Audit Content at ACI Learning. So what exactly is ACI Learning? ACI Learning trains leaders in audit, cybersecurity, and IT, delivering lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Many of you attending today may know or have heard of MIS Training Institute, or MISTI. MISTI has been training auditors, risk and compliance, fraud, and information security professionals worldwide for over 40 years. MISTI is now part of and is being rebranded as ACI Learning. Check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. We'd love to get questions from you as we go along. Please put your questions in the question panel in GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. We'll be sure to get to your questions right after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. You can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links in the Handouts panel. Now let's welcome Lauren and Hernan to today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. Where would you like to begin?
Thank you, Lauren. And Lauren, it's so good to be here with you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about writing effective reports for auditors.
It is such an important topic. You are really going to share some great insights with us, and we're looking forward to it because that is something that auditors do a lot, whether it is emails, whether it is memos, whether it is narratives, whether it's reports, you name it. We write a lot. So enhancing our skill set in that area is going to be very, very productive for all of us. So thank you very much for joining us. Where should we begin?
So, Hernan, I want to start off with a question for you. Since you have been an
Sure.
auditor for many, many years, in your life, how many audit reports have you written?
I would probably say a few hundred. It's been a long history with as a practitioner and different things that I've done in the profession, but definitely as reports go, definitely hundreds.
It's a good place to start. So, my next question for you is, did you once struggle with writing audit reports, or were you always good at it from the very beginning?
No, especially at the very beginning. It's a tough lift, and you're always nervous about how you're going to go about it, how you're going to get all your thoughts to make sure that you're communicating effectively. So yes, it is a bit of a struggle at first, especially. You get a bit more comfortable with time, but yes, it's always something that you really need to work at. So any tips you can share with us will definitely go a long way because even that have done so much work, definitely have benefit over the years from some tips and tools and techniques that I've acquired along the way. So from my perspective, I'm always looking for new ways to make this process better. And I'm sure our viewers will also be very, very interested in that as well.
Well, the first thing I want to point out is that writing is always improving. Even if you are a great writer, you can always be a little bit better when it comes to writing. And we want to make sure that we give people some tips and tricks to make writing a little bit easier because not everything needs to be hard. And writing can be hard or it can be really fun. And let's talk about how we make it fun. So
Excellent.
Hernan, typically when you were writing audit reports, um, did you send them to the same people each time or was it different people?
No, it varied. Every client was different, and even when I was working within an organization, either as an employee of the organization or servicing the same organization over and over with different reviews, there were times when there were some differences in terms of who was on the distribution list. So no, it varies.
And that's a really good point. So the first tip I have for most people that are writing reports is to start with an audience analysis. Um, and so let's talk about what an audience analysis is to get us started. So an audience analysis is really the first step you want to do when you're writing any kind of report. You want to think about who are you sending it to, and if we're sending it to different kinds of people, how do we need to start with things like tone? So if you're sending something to someone in the C-suite, perhaps, you might change the tone a little bit than sending your buddy a text on a Saturday. You don't want to wear a ball gown to a baseball game.
Mhm.
So we need to think about tone. So one of my tips and tricks for tone is making sure that we're using a tone that's maybe a little bit more elevated, a little bit formal. Hernan, in your early days of auditing, did you ever have to think about, hey, am I sending the right tone? Or ever make any blunders like that?
Yeah, tone in a number of different ways. Part of it was the organization itself, and once you get to know the people, you got to get a sense about what tone you need to convey there, but also the severity of the message. So if the audit went well, that's one thing. If there were very serious things you needed to convey, then you need to also think about that, how receptive they were to the verbal communications. That also needs to be considered because in some cases, they're going to be very, let's call it, sore about it. In other cases, they're okay with it. So again, all of these different things need to kind of match. I think of it as kind of trying to be symmetric about these kinds of things so you align with the culture, align with the tone you're trying to convey with because of the results of the engagement. Those kinds of things is what come to mind.
And I completely agree with you. Tone is really important. So, one thing when we're writing an audit report or even documenting different pieces of the audit process, which is a big part of the audit report, is thinking about that tone and what we're trying to communicate. Because a lot of what we're saying could be lost by tone. So, Hernan, you just made a really interesting point about how you have to think about how the audience is going to receive it. So, if you're giving feedback, we want to try to make that feedback not too accusatory because someone then's going to reject it right from the get go because they feel like they're being blamed for any kinds of problems that might be being addressed in that audit report, or in the remediation that needs to be done as a result of that audit report. The other thing beyond tone that we want to think about is form. We want to talk about the form of what we're sending it. So we're talking a little bit about audit reports right now, but what are some of the other forms of things that you've sent um, different audit information through, Hernan?
Yeah, so a number of different things. So some of it will be emails. When you're asking for information or clarification about something, or you're trying to confirm your understanding of something, you're requesting documents, perhaps, or data and records and files. It could also be just a narrative that you're describing a process. So you're trying to document that, and then you may need to share that with the client as well, just to make sure that you got it right. So these are some examples of other types of written documents or assets that you create when you're engaging with a client, either as an auditor or as doing a special work or engagement or a consulting type engagement. So either way, there's a lot of writing, different forms, some of them short, some of them longer as well.
So let's actually take a little bit of a deep dive into the emails.
Mhm.
And then we can talk a little bit about narratives. So when we're sending an email, that also becomes part of the audit report, does it not? Part of the whole collection of documents that we need.
The collection, yes, becomes part of the work papers. Exactly, yes.
So when we're thinking about sending those emails, although we might be friendly with different people within the company, we want to remember that some of these documents are going to be part of the official record. So you want to think about what that tone and that form looks like in an email. So in case it comes back up and someone else is looking at it, we want to make sure that we're choosing the appropriate form and the tone that we're using for the email. So that goes back to my original point about, let's think about maybe making the tone a little bit more formal, even if you're used to sending emails in a slightly less formal way. We want to think about, what will this look like if we're looking at it months, weeks, or even years down the road as part of the working papers that came with this audit. The other piece that we want to talk about is narratives. So narratives usually are a bit longer because we're documenting a process. And it's pretty easy within a narrative to slip into a different form or even a different tone. So it's a good thing to pre-plan that and to think about that audience analysis as we're talking about the narrative. And since most audit reports are written by teams, or at least contributed to by teams, it's a good idea to set some of those expectations early in the audit process so that we're meeting the expectations of form and tone as we're going through, and we're not having to readjust or even course correct later on, because that would
You
be
know,
a huge
Lauren,
right.
I'm laughing a little bit because what you just brought up some very interesting memories. Along the way, early in the middle or later in my career, I remember so many instances working with managers who will then have these pet peeves about different things. Semicolon to use or not to use. There are different words, like user versus usage, and things like therefore, and there are different things like that. I mean, I can give you a lot of examples along the way, but there were so many instances along the lines of what you just brought up. So having a meeting early on, if you have certain things that you would like them not to do, or if there are certain things that you really want them to do, I think it's very helpful. And we used to call it an expectation meeting, and some of it had to do with communication and protocols and so on. But I think this fits right in there as well. So as we're thinking about the product we're going to prepare, whether it's narratives, because they're kind of work paper like, and then we have their report, the draft and the final, but all of these things, maybe it's a good idea to spend a few minutes with the team and just say, okay, when we're writing narratives, these are some of the things we probably want to make sure we do or don't do. And the same thing goes for the report and all of the other elements, because I think that'll help us alleviate some of the pressure people may feel like, and of course, reduce the amount of editing that will happen later.
Oh, editing. That's like one of the worst things, is having to go back and edit and adjust. Um, and I think we all like to do things right the first time, and setting those
Mhm.
expectations is hugely important, especially if someone has, a big quirk about a language thing. So like if your team is split on that Oxford comma, you guys should talk about it early and decide, who are we doing an Oxford comma or are we not? And just make it
Right.
consistent throughout the entire thing. But that's a really good point, Hernan. The last thing that you want to think about when we're doing an audience analysis is language. And I know that's something that we're using language right now. It's something that we often think about as secondary. But we want to think about the kinds of language that we're using, and language often ties into the tone and the form. So if we're
Mhm.
documenting something that is more about a process, is the best type of language to use descriptive narrative, or is it something like a concise bullet point? And we want to think about those different things as we're thinking about the forms and the tones that we're taking, and also the time that people are going to spend reading it. So although we want to think that everyone reads every single page and every single word of every single document, um, I don't think that's always the
That's not the
case.
case. No.
We want to use concise and precise language where we can, so that we have the best chance of the most people reading the documents. Because Hernan, I'm guessing when you were leading audit teams, at some point you got a nice 40-page audit report that had all this beautiful descriptive language. Um, but you
Oh,
also had
yes.
12 others.
Yes, that definitely reflects what I've experienced, but also what the profession has been going through. So a lot of auditors have gone through that transition too, where in the past the assumption was that if it was bigger, it was better. If it was long, it meant you did a lot of work, maybe even good work, right? But there's a lot reflected in this very heavy document, and the thing is that now people just don't have the time. They need you to get to the point. Of course, they want it to be complete and to be accurate and really convey effectively. But you also have to be precise and concise. So from that perspective, then those 40 plus, and I've seen reports that are even longer than 40 pages. And as I've talked seminars and spoken with a lot of auditors along the way over the last few years, some organizations still struggling with the length of their reports. In some cases, they're still stuck in that very long report format. But by and large, we're all trying to move towards the shorter ones, just in recognition of the fact that people just don't have the time to read all of that. And because it takes hopefully less time to write. But that's not always true, though. You have to be very careful not to assume that because it's short, you're going to write it quickly. It may take some time there, but I would love to hear more from you about these things.
No, you're exactly right. And especially since we've moved to a more digital world, we don't have that indicator of having boxes of paper and trying to fly across the US and meet a weight requirement because we can just send it digitally. Like we don't have that anymore. So you can't, you could send a ream of paper by email and it takes about the same amount of space in your suitcase as if you sent 2 pages. So we have to think about that as we're going on. But as we're considering writing and precise and concise, there's actually some tools and applications that I like to use to help me
Okay,
do things a little bit better. Um,
awesome.
and I like to think about these as kind of my level up from what the Word documents has to offer with our little red squiggly lines. One of
Oh,
my
I
favorite.
live for those.
Oh, yeah, I love my red squiggly lines. I'm like, get rid of all the squiggles, no squiggles. Um,
Right.
but one of the tools that my team actually uses and that I really enjoy using is Grammarly. Have you ever had the opportunity to use Grammarly before, Hernan?
I've I've heard of it, but I haven't extensively. So tell us more about it.
So Grammarly is a great tool. It's like the level up of your Word. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to check your emails, it allows you to check your Word documents, your narratives, your audit reports for some of those silly things like typos or comma splices, things that make you blush after you've sent the email off because you're like, oh no, I made an error. But this catches that before you hit that send button so that you don't have to try to
Oh, good.
frantically pull back the email or pull back
Okay.
the report.
Okay. Awesome.
The other thing that I really like to use as we're thinking about different resources to be more precise and concise is actually consulting different areas for reference. So a reference that I like to use is actually Grammar Girl. And what that allows us to do is to check what are the rules on different things. So audit reports often have numbers, right, Hernan? Maybe just a
Yep,
few.
they do. They do.
Um,
Quite a few.
so one of the big questions that I would always get when I was teaching writing was, so when do I write out the number and when do I use the Roman numeral? That's a big question that we always have. And
Yes.
so I at this point in my life I have that rule memorized. But not everyone does, and that's perfectly okay. But Grammar Girl, she's a great resource. You go on there, you look what's the rule for using numbers, and one of those is if it's a single word, you type it out. If it's multi-word, so like 23, um, you would write the Roman numeral out, 2 and 3.
Okay.
It's a nice thing to have. It's a nice tool to have at your disposal. It gives you that confidence and that ease as you're writing so that you're not worried about making errors of inconsistency or even incorrect errors.
Right.
The other
Okay.
one in documents that we have to talk a lot about are capitalization. And when do we capitalize? When don't we capitalize? When do we do it in a heading? When don't we do it in a heading? And as we were talking about before, Hernan, one of the things we recommend doing is setting those expectations early and often and talking about them. Um, but a tool that you can use to double check that you're doing it accurately is using a capitalization reference. And that can be super helpful to make sure you're making the right kind of capitalization if you need it. And then
Yeah,
my
and on the note of the capitalization, you mentioned the headers and so on, names of systems, name of places, of course, name of people, but you have acronyms, various things like those. So all of those kinds of things, I would, raise a question as, should I do it this way? Should I do it that way? So from what you're sharing with us, these are great resources to help us get answers to those and also be able to make it a reference to our team so we can tell them, okay, we're doing it this way because sometimes what happens, and I've been in so many situations where you edit something for someone and you tell them how you would like them to change it, and then you can tell that their inclination is this really a rule or is that your preference? So just to avoid all of that dynamic, we can always make sure we reference where the rules are coming from, so we can say, okay, this is why we're doing it this way. And I think it'll go a long way to helping us put everybody at ease and make sure we're being consistent, because that's, I think, is a very important aspect of effective writing, is making sure that anything that department produces is going to follow similar standards in terms of its quality. So what you're sharing with us, I think, is really, really going to help us a lot.
that's the hope, Hernan. But I think also, to our point earlier, having that meeting early to talk about what expectations are and talking about some of these things and then checking if they're rules or just preferences is a really good way to make sure that we're all on the same page as we're writing these big reports that are getting sent to people at all different levels of the company to enact those changes.
Exactly.
So Hernan, when you write reports, do you ever have to cite anything? Do you ever have to use other references?
Occasionally, a lot of the work that I've done has been in the private sector where you don't have a lot of that. You may have a lot more in terms of, for example, when you're writing your narratives and you're documenting certain things or you're doing some research, but it does happen. In the public sector, I know it happens a lot more often, and they have to cite a lot of different rules, regulations, and various things like those. So, depending on where you work and what kind of product you're preparing, you may or may not. But at the end of the day, it's always good to know how you're supposed to do it. So, it sounds to me like you have something to share with us as relates to citation. Is that right?
Oh, I definitely do, because one of the
Okay.
rules that I always taught students at the university, and I still teach it to my teams, and when I work with subject matter experts like yourself and others, it's always better to cite and to be overly cautious about citation rather than being underly cautious. And one of the tools that I actually use a lot is just the Purdue Owl. It's a free resource. It's an easier to reference version than something like the APA handbook. And it's a quick reference for how do you cite these different things, because there is absolutely nothing worse than forgetting to cite something and then being accused of plagiarism or not giving credit to someone who did a bunch of work. So it's a really good idea to make sure we're documenting and staying consistent in that documentation.
And
Um,
Lauren, you mentioned the matter of plagiarism, which of course is a very serious issue. But even if our viewers and listeners are thinking in terms of, well, that's not necessarily what my concern is. I just need to say where something is. But think about this, and I've been in situations, unfortunately, and that's why what you're describing rings very loudly in my mind. Is that I've been in situations where I know that I remember I saw something somewhere, and I have a quick reference to it, but it's not comprehensive enough. It is not clear enough even to me. So then when I need to go back, let's say my manager asked me about it or the client asked me, well, where did you see that? Or what's the source for this? Or I would like to see it myself. Then you have to go back and try to dig it up all over again because you were not very clear about exactly where that came from. So it also has an efficiency component to it. You cite it correctly and appropriately. That way, when you need to go back to find it, it's a lot easier for you to find it as well. And if everybody follows these standards, then it makes it easier for the whole team and the whole department. So part of my learning along the way has been that citation is important for that other perspective. Of course, like I said, the whole dynamic around plagiarism is, of course, a serious one. But even if you think of it from an efficiency and consistency perspective, this is also a very, very good thing to keep in mind.
That's a really good point, and also for legacy. So often when you're working on reports moving into the future, it's a good idea if you know you have a reference to something and you're like, "Oh, I know I referenced that in a previous audit report." You can always go back and look. That's not cheating, that's just working smart, and then you have that documentation and you're going
Exactly.
10 times faster than if you were having to go back, reread, find it, do some digging, and then find that exact spot. You can just go back to your citation and be like, oh, I have it here. It's great.
That's right.
So,
Exactly. Exactly.
and these are just some of the tools that I recommend using. Even if you don't use them often and you use them every once in a while, it can save you a lot of time and it can save you a lot of heartache in having some of these at your disposal so that you're writing confidently and competently as you're going through. So
Excellent. Excellent. Lauren, thank you so much. So, what are some of the other things we need to keep in mind? These resources were fantastic, by the way. What else should we know about as we have you here so that we can benefit from your insights about this topic?
So we've talked about some actual physical tools that we can use, but let's talk about what tools we can put into practice. So
Okay.
the best form of a written report of any kind is an accurate one. There's nothing worse than reading a report and realizing about halfway through you're reading it that you maybe misrepresented some facts. So we
Mhm.
always want to take some time, especially as we're thinking about reviewing our audit reports or our working papers or our memos and our emails to read for accuracy. So Hernan, when you were working on writing all kinds of different documents for audits, um, how did you handle accuracy? Did you have a
Well, a
plan?
lot of it is making sure you get the facts right. Yes, is verifying your mathematical accuracy, the completeness of the calculation, the accuracy of the calculation, the integrity of the formulas. Again, just making sure you get the numbers right. So accuracy in terms of that numerical piece, that's part of it, but also in terms of what someone may have told you or what you saw somewhere. So accuracy in the notes that you took about that interview or in your review of a report or something like it. But yes, those are some of the things that come to mind.
So one thing I recommend doing for reading for accuracy is having a second set of eyes read for accuracy. So often
Okay.
having someone else look through your report is a really good idea because although we always try to be accurate and we know what we're trying to say, it's not how it always comes across as you're writing it for the reader. So we always want to keep in mind who the reader is and how the reader might be approaching the writing that you're doing. And we also want to
So you
make
can,
it, oh, sorry, go
Lauren.
ahead.
So sorry. One quick thing here. So over the years and talking with auditors, there are a couple of different ways I've seen something along these lines, and just to kind of reiterate for our viewers and our listeners, so we can have it done formally, where you can have a mechanism within our process that when someone writes something, and you can basically break it down, also what it is and how you're going to do it, but when before you submit it, you have someone else review it. So that kind of like the process is built around that principle. But you can also do it informally. So even if your department doesn't have it as a standard operating procedure, you can just reach over to your colleague and say, "Hey, could you take a look at this for me and tell me what you think? Is it clear? Is it complete? Does it make sense?" So you can also have like a buddy and have that done informally, but we still achieve the thing that you're just describing, which is having another pair of eyes. Is this something like what you're describing to us?
Exactly. I mean, Hernan, I don't think it's a surprise that you and I work together sometimes outside of this webinar. And I can
Yes.
definitely say, I've said, hey, Hernan, can you read this and just make sure it's accurate? And you're like, oh, yeah, it's just a ping away. It's a great thing to have that second set of eyes to make sure that, it is accurate so that as you're sending it out, um, someone's not like, that's not accurate. Um, the other added benefit of having someone else look at something that you've written is you get to read for tone. So you know how you intend to say something. But actually, one of the best phrases that I ever encountered is tone is not what you throw out, it's what you perceive. Or what's being perceived. So having someone else with a fresh set of eyes read that tone. So they're reading for tone and they're reading for accuracy because we can let some other tools catch the grammar mistakes sometimes, although it's a good idea to also read for that. Having someone else read for tone is a really good idea to make sure that we're not venturing into that accusatory territory so that people are receptive to what we're writing. Because Hernan, I'm sure this has happened to you. I hope it happened few and far between, but where you sent something and it was a little bit too accusatory and they just immediately rejected what you were saying, um,
Right.
even though it had great information in it.
Right.
Um,
Yes, and sometimes they'll object to the tone, not for the to the factual accuracy of what you're presenting. The accuracy may be there, the message is that, but the way it's presented, the message is confused, and the tone kind of overrides it. So absolutely, I agree. I've been there. I've been there. So we just went over two of those items. What is the what is there another one?
there's another. So one thing that I always recommend doing, even if you have the best tools downloaded on your computer as you're writing, is still to check for spelling and accuracy, for spelling and grammar. We know that as you're writing something, it's really common to skip a word, to spell something wrong, to pick the wrong homophone. So it's always a really good idea to have just another quick set of eyes, check something for spelling and grammar so that we don't miss anything, because nothing makes your message degraded quite like having a giant typo in the middle of a paragraph. It makes someone question if you actually do know what you're talking about, which is never a good thing, because as the writer of those audit reports, you are the expert on that audit report. Um, and then the last thing that I like to remember to do is, even if I don't have another set of eyes, I like to set aside whatever I'm writing for at least an hour or two. It's a good time to get another cup of coffee in that time, um, and double check for consistency. Just read through the report and finish from start to end and check for consistency, because actually, time and yourself can be a second set of eyes as necessary.
Mhm.
Um, Hernan, as you've been writing and you've gotten better and better at writing, have you had the chance to ever put these four things into practice?
Yes, I have actually. I mean, I like the way you present in a very systematic and organized way. I kind of done some of these things kind of informally, kind of you kind of learn and you kind of do it on your own way. But I like the way you organize it this way. But absolutely, yes, in terms of looking at the accuracy and verifying all of your facts, figures, dates, locations, all of those things, checking in terms of making sure you get the right tone, and sometimes another person can help you very much there. But sometimes, you know what I found? You mentioned the fourth item being let it rest for a little bit, right? And then go back to it or edit it and then go back. Sometimes I found that when I go back later to reread it, I find sometimes that the tone needs to be adjusted because maybe for whatever reason, right? At the time you presented things in a certain way, and then when you read it later, you say, "Ooh, I'm glad I didn't send it because this is not how I wanted this thing to come across," right? Or I must be having a bad day. Maybe I was too hungry, or something like it, right? I get grumpy when I'm hungry. So those kinds of things sometimes get in the way, and it may be reflected in your writing. So it's a good thing to do that. So I think that this way is a very good way and organized and structured and simple as well because you're not breaking down into four main components, but each one of those pack a lot of helpful techniques to make sure that our writing is going to be far more effective. So I like that.
Exactly. And if you take one thing away from this webinar, I guess it's our words of Hernan, which is never write hangry. Just never do it. Write hangry.
Exactly, exactly. That's a good rule.
So just we have a last few points that I want to talk about. And one of those is talking about what kind of documents do you need to do to set yourself up for success. So when you're writing something as big as an audit report, what are some of the documents that you've used in the past to really help you be effective in that writing of an audit report, Hernan?
So, are you thinking in terms of the like the interview notes, reports that you review, the interview documentation, memos that you read from the client, minutes from their meetings that you're looking at, org charts, flow charts? Is that what you have in mind?
That's exactly what I had in mind. Also,
Okay.
project plans. Project plans should
Yes.
be added in there. So it's better when we're gathering documents and we're going to sit down and start to write those audit reports or memos or emails or narratives, is to have all of our documents in one place. So that way we're not disrupting our flow of writing. We always want to think about what can be at our fingertips to help us support our writing so that we're not having to stop our writing flow to go find that one Excel document that we know someone maybe emailed us. And then the worst thing that could happen is we have to go and request that email document and then we have to wait. So then you've really just messed with your flow. But if you have all those documents collected, you can just find them at your fingertips, which is a really great way to do it. The other piece of advice I have about documents is in that initial meeting, as you're thinking about setting expectations, is thinking about how you want to label your documents, where you want to store them. And then here's a really big one. Who should have access to those documents? Especially as you're thinking about some of these documents like org charts and narratives can be kind of sensitive. So in the past, Hernan, when you had boxes of files, did you guys just share them back and forth, or did you have a way of more systematically doing that?
Well, no, we had a very systematic way to do it, and that goes back to the department's practices and the protocol that they have established. Because we tend to have the whole referencing protocol around that too. So how you reference one document with another, and you make sure everything is going to be into your work papers. So early in my career, when it was very paper intensive, it was all done manually, and we had, of course, our formula for how we were going to, or the algorithm for how you're going to reference the items, and a lot of it, of course, comes back from external audit and so on. But then later on, of course, as you start to become more digitized, the documents go into a repository. You have your work paper management software or application, and then the documents are uploaded to different places, and then you are able to refer back to them that way. But along the way, and I know some of our viewers, and I've had many conversations with auditors over the years where they may have things just in folders, digital folders, but they have things into folders. And if you don't have a good naming convention, and if you don't have a good way of organizing all of these documents, you end up in the predicament that you just highlighted, Lauren, where people have to go through over and over trying to figure out where things are coming from. So it is a good idea, and this probably goes right back to that expectations meeting. And even before that, when you go into your training and setting your operating procedures, is to make sure everyone understands how we're going to name things, where we're going to host things, or where we're going to save them. And if it's electronic work papers, similar thing in terms of making sure that we have a good system for all of these documents to be kept protected, like you said, and then be able to go back to them if we need to. Because if we need to verify accuracy, or if we need to just confirm something just to make sure we got it right, or just to add another piece of information to the report, we need to be able to get there easily. So I think that this has a lot of implications for helping us make that report writing process more effective.
I would agree, Hernan, that you summarized it super well. So, uh, you know, organize them, make sure it's labeled correctly. But the other thing in organization that we want to think about, so we've talked about how do we organize our process, how do we organize our documents. Let's talk about how we want to make sure that we organize our writing process as well. So we've talked
Okay.
about a lot of different things today as we were talking about how do we write more effectively. And some of those things is the first thing we always want to think about is who are we sending this to? Are we sending it to the C-suite? Are we sending it to other managers? Are we sending it to people below those managers to make these action items? That's one of our first things we want to always consider as we are building out our writing process is who is it going to be in the hands of and how is it going to be perceived? The other
Yeah.
thing that it's a good idea to think about is how many people are going to see this? Because imagine if you have a typo on page 2 and we're sending out to 600 people. That is a very visible typo, is it not, Hernan?
Oh,
Um,
yes, absolutely. Hmm.
So we want to think about how many people we're sending it to, and are we sending it to the right people in the right form? So it's a good idea to think about that because we want the right information to be in the hands of the right people. And then finally, what are we sending out? Are we sending out a memo? Are we sending out an audit report? Does everyone need to get the audit report? We want to think very carefully about how and what we're sending and when we're sending it. And of course, you always want to make sure that we're reviewing those papers before we're sending them out so that we don't have any silly errors. And those are the big things when I'm writing that I recommend everyone do as they're thinking about their writing process. So it's actually a good time for us to think about all those writing processes so that it doesn't end up like something with a Q&A. Like our writing paper doesn't end up with a bunch of Q&A of having to clarify different things.
I agree. I think that being careful and planning, then of course executing along the lines of what you just described and shared with us, using the tools that you shared, the process that you shared with us, and some of the things to be on the lookout for. I think it's going to help us tremendously to improve the writing process and have a better product and more professional looking product that is going to convey the message like we intended it to. So thank you very much. This has been very, very helpful.
I'm glad. Um, Thank you, Hernan.
Okay, thank you. So let's hear from Lauren Deal. So we have another Lauren, and she's going to help us with the next phase of our program today.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren and Hernan. You're right. I'm Lauren Deal. We've got Lauren Primuth. But to our viewers, if you have any questions, be sure to go and enter them into the chat panel right now on the right side of your screen. Before we actually get to the Q&A, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is a subscription-based on-demand audit training that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription actually costs less than a 3-day classroom course, there it is, and it allows you to gain access to the training you need at any time from anywhere. Visit acilearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV and get a free team trial. All right, Dr. Hernan, let's start with our first question.
Very good. Thank you very much, Lauren. So, Lauren, we have a question from Steve, and he asks, what is one of the biggest mistakes someone can make when beginning a report? What is one of the biggest mistakes someone can make when beginning a report?
So that's a really good question, Hernan. And I think we've all been in the space where we've made a mistake when we're starting writing. And I think the first thing that, and one of the biggest mistakes that someone can make is not having a plan for how they're going to write. And just thinking that they can just wing it from the very beginning. So having a good plan in place, having those expectation calls, and making sure that you're setting yourself up for success is a really great idea. To make sure that that report writing goes as well as it possibly can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have another question. This is from Jorge. He asks, how can you prevent a writing blunder?
So Hernan, I think you and I talked a little bit about that because I think both you and I have had some writing blunders in the past. Not together, independently, of course, but making sure that we set those expectations early, that we clarify those expectations often, that we're using the tools that we have at our disposal to make sure that we are working effectively and efficiently, because we want to work smart, and we want to be able to use the resources at our disposal to get across the best message that is possible.
Very, very good. Thank you very much. That's a great advice there. So we have another question from Scheherazade asking, how does an auditor formulate relevant recommendations in order to bring value to the organization? How does an auditor formulate relevant recommendations in order to bring value to the organization?
So I think this is a really good question because I think it gets at a few different things. I think a message is only as good as as it is received. So what I mean by that is that you need to think about certain different aspects of your message. The first part of that is, how is the message that you're sharing or the recommendation that you're sharing about to be perceived? So there's a big difference between someone saying, this is something that I've seen the team do very well, but I think this could be improved, versus you're doing this wrong and you need to change this immediately. Those two things might have the same type of recommendation in them, but the first one is going to be perceived and taken as value to the organization, rather the second one feels a little bit like critique, and kind of harsh critique. So we want to think about formulating the message that we're sending in a way that is going to be received as being helpful and constructive, rather than just being critical for the sake of being critical. So it's about tone and it's about language, but it's also about taking in what you're seeing and thinking about how that can be improved incrementally, rather than just saying we need to throw out the baby in the bathwater immediately because nothing's working.
Yeah, yeah. That is very, very helpful advice. And some of my experiences have been along the same lines where you have a great idea, and if you convey it the wrong way and your tone is not constructive enough, they may take it the wrong way, and then you may miss the opportunity to help them. So, this is a great advice. So, thank you very much for that insight. So, we have another question from Agron who's asking, what is the difference between recommendations and suggestions in the internal audit report? What is the difference between recommendations and suggestions in the internal audit report?
So in in my opinion, recommendations are suggestions are really hard to parse. Recommendations and suggestions are things that you want to see changed. Um, Now, I think recommendations could often be a little bit more formal, but I think for the most part, they're very similar in that they're trying to enact change. Is that your experience as well, Hernan?
Yes, exactly, exactly. So I would probably need to dig a little bit further into the organization and how they have used the terms in the past and in the present, of course. But my assumption is that perhaps it's along the lines of what you just highlighted, where maybe the suggestion is more of a verbal. We think this will help you, but there's really no hard push on that. But recommendation a little bit stronger. That we think that you should really do this kind of, don't want to say wink, wink, but wink, wink, right? And then, of course, you're going to have kind of mandates, which, of course, as auditors, we have to be very careful. Now, I'm wondering if Agron is also looking at it from the perspective of how the profession has struggled to some extent with this idea of we make recommendations but not mandates. We don't own the process. The business does. So how do we do that? And whether it's a recommendation that they can accept or reject, or it is something that they must do. So I think what I would suggest to Agron as well is to take a close look at how these words are used. Perhaps have a way of defining it within the organization so that the language is clear within the team, within the department, and within the organization. So the terms are used consistently, and if there is an implied message behind the choice of words, that is understood by everyone who sees it. So I think that that is probably an important thing to do here. But I agree with you, Lauren. I think that's partly what will be helpful in that regard. Okay, so let's take a look at the next one. How do you handle situations? This is from James. How do you handle situations when you and the supervisor disagree with the way a sentence is written? This is an interesting question. I've been there so many times. So, how do you handle situations when you and the supervisor disagree with the way a sentence is written?
So this is a good question, and this is about so much more than just a written sentence. Because I think the easy answer is, you know, to talk about why you're seeing that difference. But I think there's a lot more at play here because if what is really being talked about is a little bit of interpersonal management and how we're dealing with that sentence. It's not quite as cut and dry with like, oh well, we're just going to go with the supervisor because they clearly know more. But what I really do think needs to be done in a situation like this is I actually think it needs to be talked about. Like you need to sit down and say, hey, you were perceiving it this way, I was perceiving it this way, and we're writing about the same thing, but where are you seeing the difference and where am I seeing the difference? And how can we put that into writing that there were two potentially different perceptions of this situation, but ultimately there's the same solution that we're suggesting or recommending
Mhm.
to make the process better. I think it's a little bit about give and take here and understanding where the other person is coming from so that you're getting the best results.
Right. Yes. And I think that the matter of what's a preference and what is really going to be very helpful is also important to convey. So to your point, in terms of having a conversation when you're making these suggestions, is to explain why you would like the change made and what's the benefit of it. Because in some cases, it could be just a preference. And we have to be careful that we don't get into this process where form takes over substance and you spend a lot of time going around in circles really not accomplishing a lot more because you don't really have a good goal for it. So that would be very helpful there as well, I believe, as well as you suggested. Vladimir is asking, should you try and use more sophisticated and technical terms, or is it best to use more simple words?
So my personal opinion on this for writing is we need to think about the reader. So we want to, so in a lot of writing, you can make the reader do work or you can make the writer do the work. And I think clear and simple is better because then you can control how that message is being perceived, or how it's being understood. I think you run the risk when you have something like technical jargon, and sophisticated terms, of either using it the wrong way, or it not being understood, and then it becoming a, a Q&A that you then have to re-level set with the client or the person that's receiving that message, because you used a term that they're not as familiar with, and we're having to go back and re-explain, and we've now then degraded the message that we're trying to share, or the recommendation or suggestion that we wanted them to make. It is degraded by the fact that we've used really technical language.
Yeah, I think that in many ways, what you're suggesting will definitely help a great deal. I believe that what will accomplish is that we make it easier for the reader to read. Now, one of the things in terms of the technical language is, understanding the readers, like you said, and making sure that it's going to be written at their level. But you need to make sure you understand the full list of people in the distribution list. Otherwise, you may be writing for some and then losing others. So by and large, I agree with you that the default should be simpler language. I think it'll go further and make it easier for everyone to follow along.
Well,
Um, yes.
Hernan, the other thing that you want to think about too is, again, that audience. So if you're writing something for other auditors, and you all work in maybe an IT audit space, and you're really used to talking about different kinds of IT audit and the acronyms, it's appropriate to use that technical language there. But if you're writing to someone that's not as familiar with audit, or maybe not as familiar with IT, you want to make it so that they can understand what you're trying to convey as well. So I think it's really audience specific.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so here's another question. This is from James. And the question is, how can you learn to be more of an active voice writer versus a passive voice writer?
Oh, I think James just he walked into the big debate about writing there. So active voice and passive voice. Everyone has an opinion about active voice and passive voice, and there is a place for both, in my opinion. Um, Passive voice can be a really good way to put distance between yourself and your subject that you're writing about, and to come off as more objective, which is sometimes what you want to do in a report. Active voice can be used very effectively if you're asking someone to do certain things and recommendations and suggestions. But passive voice has its place too. And passive voice, because of high school for all of us, got a really bad rap. Like, never use passive voice. It's bad writing, it's bad etiquette. But passive voice does have its place. And I think the easiest way to think about active and passive voice is, what part of the report are you working on, and what message are you trying to convey? So if you're trying to be objective, saying, I see this, in my opinion, I think this, is not as effective as something as, this was done throughout the audit process, because then you're taking a step back and being a lot more objective and more of an observer than if you're giving your direct opinion. So you can make it as simple as making simple declarative sentences. That's the easiest way to do it. But I think the bigger question here is active or passive voice a better use in the situation that you're trying to convey your message?
Yeah, yeah. In my practice, I found that predominantly being active voice, every once in a while, a passive voice can soften a little bit the tone overall, or a particular finding or issue you're trying to convey to the client. But by and large, passive makes it sound more hesitant, almost as you're a little bit, you're not sure. The active voice sounds more authoritative in a way. I guess we can use that word, or more confident is probably a better way to describe it. So I would say that by and large, we should try to lean towards active voice. Here's a question for Mohammed. What is your advice on inserting tables in the body of the report?
I think tables are a great way to disseminate information in a concise and precise way. Um, I think making sure that they are clearly defined in what the expectations of how they look in the audit report is very important. So if you have multiple tables, they should all be consistent and they should all be labeled in the same way. That would be my advice for inserting tables in the body of report, is make it consistent, make it concise, and make it easy to read and reference.
So Christine is asking a very interesting question. So she's asking, shall the tone of the message be the same when presenting critical and less critical findings in audit reports? Or should the tone be different to get the attention of management for more critical findings? Let me read it again. Shall the tone of the message be the same when presenting critical and less critical findings in audit reports? Or should the tone be different to get the attention of management for more critical findings?
So I think when we're thinking about the tone, I think we might have scared people a little bit from using critical tone. There is a time and a place for being critical, especially if actions need to be corrective. But there's a way to make it not accusatory, I think, is the thing that we want to take away from how we're controlling our tone in different parts of an audit report. So although you want the message to come across as being, hey, this is serious, we need to take action on this now, there's a difference between this is a serious topic that we need to adjust versus blaming someone. So I think that tone needs to be reflected in the in how you're presenting that information. But I think it's okay to say, hey, this is a critical finding. This is something we need to pay attention to, and this needs action right now, without blaming someone that they did something wrong.
Okay, great, very good. So once again, making sure we are understanding the message we want to convey and the audience that is going to read the report. So we have a question from Musa asking, if the client asks the auditor for a meeting to explain the observations, is this indication that you have an issue in writing the report?
I don't think so. I think writing is a really powerful tool, but I also think having a conversation is a really powerful tool. It can simply be understanding where you're coming from and what you're seeing, and then a way for them to talk through what you're seeing and what you're recommending as changes. I don't think that necessarily means that you have an issue in the report writing. I think it just means they want a conversation. They want to have more back and forth with you about what you're finding.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. You have been so helpful understanding again, the key components of effective writing, the different types of writing that we produce, thinking in terms of the process itself and how we can go about making sure that this is going to be a process that's going to yield the results that we hope for. There is so much we need to communicate as auditors. And of course, some of the things that we need to do are going to, in some cases, be a little bit nuanced because of the organization, their culture, their needs, their history, how complex the environment is, and the kinds of things we need to convey to them, and how much we have built in terms of goodwill with the client so they understand, they know us, and then they know what to expect from the internal audit function. So all of these things come together, and you have done a wonderful job helping us better understand who we can get better at this very complex process. So thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope it helps all of our auditors out there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. But we've run out of time for this webinar. For Lauren Primuth and Hernan Murdock, I'm Lauren Deal. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back here again soon.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You will receive a link to the webinar recording delivered to your inbox. See you next time.